In the autumn of 1883, in the high, dry country east of the Mogollon Rim in Arizona Territory, there was a quarter section of land that nobody wanted. The parcel sat at an elevation of roughly 5,000 feet between two working ranches whose owners had each, independently, investigated the possibility of acquiring it over the previous decade and reached the same conclusion. The ground was limestone under a thin skin of desert soil. The seasonal drainage that crossed the southern edge ran no more than 6 weeks in a wet year, and everything beneath the surface was dead rock. There was a small flat shelf on the north end that might have supported a structure, and there were views, if views were what a man was after. Neither the land's eastern neighbor nor its northern one was in the business of buying views. The Water Witchers had walked it twice. The first man carried a forked willow branch and declared the ground solid limestone all the way down, his rod lying flat and still as a fence post from the north end to the south. The second man used a copper rod, and he said the same thing, though he added that the seller ought to be grateful anyone had paid for the survey at all. The county assessor had reduced the parcel's value 3 years running, citing the permanent absence of water and the unsuitability of the soil for any kind of cultivation that required moisture to complete. The ranchers who bordered it on the east and north had looked at the land, looked at the dry creek bed that threaded through its southern edge, and quietly declined every overture to buy it at any price. The territorial government had acquired the parcel through tax default in 1880 from a homesteader named Garrow, who had attempted to run a small sheep operation on it for 2 seasons and abandoned the effort when his second water-hauling mule went lame on the rocky track from town. Garrow had left the land without sentiment and without a forwarding address. For 3 years, the parcel sat on the county books, its annual assessment declining steadily, its listing in the auction notices growing shorter each time it appeared. When the Maricopa County land auction opened on the 14th of October, the parcel drew a small crowd, the way a dead horse draws flies, not out of appetite but out of a certain morbid fascination with how low a thing could go. The auctioneer was a man named Hollis Crane, and he had a gift for ceremony, for wringing drama from even the most forgettable lots. He read the legal description with some gravity. He noted the acreage, 160 acres of upland desert scrub, 1 seasonal drainage, no improvements, no standing water, no well. He mentioned as a courtesy that 2 independent water assessments had confirmed the absence of any subsurface water source. He paused to let this register. A woman near the back of the crowd raised her hand. She was 28 years old, slight in build but not in posture, with the kind of stillness that people sometimes mistake for inattention. Her name was Clara Finch. She had arrived in Prescott 6 weeks earlier with a letter of introduction to a surveyor who had since died of a fever, a leather satchel of drafting tools, and $31 and some cents to her name. She wore a cream-colored pioneer dress with a small faded print at the hem, and a vivid red wool shawl draped over her shoulders that had belonged to her father. The shawl was the brightest thing about her, and it was old enough at the collar to show the texture of years of hard use and careful keeping. She raised her hand, and she did not lower it until Hollis Crane said, with some uncertainty, $6 and no bids against her. The laughter was not unkind exactly. It was the laughter of men who could not think of any other response to something they did not understand. One of the ranchers from the east border muttered something to his neighbor about the well being dry and the land being worth the price of the paper the deed was printed on. Another man said she had bought herself 160 acres of hard luck. A third man, who may have been a land agent of some kind by his coat, said nothing at all but looked at her with an expression of mild professional concern, as though he were calculating the cost of explaining this to her later. Hollis Crane gave her a receipt, and the look that county officials reserve for women who have just done something inadvisable in public. Clara Finch folded the receipt into her satchel and walked out into the October sun without looking at any of them. If you have ever been told that something holds nothing, that it is empty, that you would be a fool to press further, stay with this story. What Clara carried onto that land and what she found at the bottom of it changed 6 families and rewrote a portion of the county record that had stood uncorrected for 11 years. She had grown up in New Mexico Territory, near Socorro, where her father had worked as a well sinker and a dipper maker, and when the work was scarce in either trade, as a hand pump mechanic who could coax water from equipment that had no business producing any. His name was Albert Finch, and he had a particular theory about water in the high desert that he repeated so often Clara could have recited it from sleep. Water follows the fracture, not the grade, not the slope of the land, not the direction a creek runs, not the logic of the surface, the fracture in the rock below. He had developed the theory over 2 decades of sinking wells in country that others had written off as waterless. He had been wrong twice, and he kept a record of those failures as carefully as he kept a record of the successes, because he believed a man learned more from the ground that confounded him than from the ground that cooperated. His notebooks, when Clara inherited them, contained entries that ran backward to 1861, some in pencil so faded they had to be read at an angle to the light, others in ink, and in the margins of the later ones were calculations and cross-references, a working mind arguing with itself over the behavior of water under stone. He taught her to read the surface for signs of what lay beneath. Not the obvious signs, the cottonwoods and willows that any child could read. He meant the finer signs, the way certain grasses yellowed at the tips in August, while the desert browned entirely around them, the way limestone outcroppings sometimes showed a thin dark band at a certain height, like a water line from a deep buried source, the way a dry creek bed, walked carefully at dawn when the light was low and raking, sometimes showed a faint depression in its center where the rock below had subsided over water rather than over void. He taught her the coupling rod method, threading the steel sections end to end until they reached 18 feet, and how to read the resistance at the bottom of each rod as it met different materials. Dense limestone rang like iron when you tapped the rod's head. Fractured limestone with voids felt softer, offered a small give. Fractured limestone with water in the voids had a quality he described as speaking, meaning the rod moved slightly in a way that bare stone did not permit. He had never found a better word for it, and Clara had never needed one. Albert Finch died in the summer of 1879, when Clara was 24, of a fever that took him in 5 days from a man who had been entirely well. He left her his tools and his notebooks and his theory about water, and he left her not much else, because a well sinker who gives most of his fees to the families who cannot pay is not a wealthy man. He was respected, which was not the same thing, and Clara was left with the tools and the respect and no particular way to convert either into a roof and a meal. She had spent 4 years after his death working as a draftsman's assistant in Socorro and then in Albuquerque, making fair copies of survey plats and learning everything she could about how the territory's land was being measured, parceled, and sold. She was meticulous and she was fast, and she charged half what the men in the office charged for the same work, because she had found that pricing herself at the same rate caused prospective employers to find reasons not to hire her, while pricing herself below them caused them to feel they were getting a bargain. She did not enjoy this calculation, but she made it clearly and without illusion about what it meant. She came to Arizona Territory because of a letter she had read in her employer's office, addressed to the surveyor she had worked for in Albuquerque, from a colleague in Prescott who described a county where the land surveys had been rushed and where the water assessments in particular were, in his word, approximate. He used the word with the deliberate precision of a man who means something stronger and is choosing not to commit it to paper. The letter was not meant for her eyes. She had read it anyway, and she had thought about it for 3 months before she packed her satchel and came west. Clara spent the first night on her 160 acres, camped beside the dry creek bed, because it was the lowest point on the land and the most sheltered from the wind. The temperature dropped hard after sundown, the way it does at elevation in the desert. The sky clear and full and indifferent, the scrub and the limestone giving up their stored heat within an hour of dark. She had a bedroll, a pot, a small supply of dried goods, and her father's tools. She had a brass case pocket level, a set of 3 steel probing rods, each 6 feet long, that coupled end to end to reach 18 feet, and the small chisel-point hammer she had carried in her left coat pocket since the week he died. She built a small fire with deadwood from the scrub and ate what she had and listened to the land. The wind came from the northwest and brought the smell of pine from the higher slopes to the west. The creek bed was pale in the firelight, sand and gravel worn smooth by water that had not run through in perhaps 3 years. The sound the land made in the absence of water was a kind of fine silence, not the thick silence of enclosed spaces, but the open-aired silence of a place that has been waiting. She didn't sleep much. She had planned not to. She rose an hour before dawn, replenished the fire, and began walking the creek bed by lantern light, holding the lantern low, moving slowly, watching the shadows that the raking light cast across the drainage floor. The technique required patience above all other things. The depression she was looking for, if it was there, would not announce itself. It would read as a slight concavity in the otherwise flat or gently sloping channel bed, a bowl perhaps 2 or 3 inches deep at its most pronounced point, running perpendicular to the drainage direction, caused by the slow subsidence of surface material over a feature below. Her father had shown her 3 such depressions over the course of her training, had made her crouch down and look at each one from a low angle until she could identify precisely where the shadow deepened and where it did not, and understand why. 2 of those 3 had produced water. The third had produced a void of a different kind, an ancient solution cavity in the limestone with no active water in it, which her father had noted in his book with a careful annotation about the differences in surface expression between a water-fed fracture and a dry one. She found what she was looking for before dawn. There was a place, roughly 40 yards above where the creek bed curved to the south, where the center of the dry channel showed a faint, elongated depression running perpendicular to the drainage's direction, as though something below had slowly settled. It was perhaps 3 feet across and ran for perhaps 8 feet along its length, and at its lowest point it was no more than 2 inches below the surrounding grade. A man walking in daylight would have passed it without notice, his eyes drawn to the horizon and the distant rock formations, as eyes in open country tend to be. In the lantern light, with the light held low and the shadows of the surface grain magnified into legibility, it read as clearly to Clara as a word printed on a page. She crouched beside it and held the lantern closer and ran one hand lightly across the surface of the sand, feeling for the slight cool that sometimes gathered in a surface depression, fed by something cold below. The sand was the same temperature as the surrounding channel, which told her nothing conclusive, and she filed it as neither confirmation nor refusal and rose to her feet. She put a small cairn of 3 stones at the head of the depression and walked back to the fire and waited for the light. She drove a coupling rod into the depression at first light. The rod sank 16 inches through sand before it struck rock. She drove a second rod, 12 inches to the north and found rock at 14 inches. A third rod, 6 inches to the south of the first, struck rock at 11 inches. The rock was not level. It dipped in the center directly below the surface depression. Not a void, a dip. A fracture line in the limestone, exactly as her father had described, running perpendicular to the drainage and descending toward the southeast. That afternoon, she rode into Prescott on a hired horse and spent 4 of her remaining dollars on a 20-foot coil of manila rope, a set of iron well-boring augers, and a tallow candle. She came back to the land the following morning and began. The work of hand-boring a test shaft in limestone is slow and exhausting, and, if done alone, requires a patience that is closer to stubbornness than to virtue. Clara knew this and had accepted it before she lifted the first auger. She set the bore point in the center of the depression, at the lowest reading she had taken, and she worked the auger handle in the way her father had shown her. A quarter turn, a half turn, a pull to clear the cuttings, a half turn, a quarter turn. Her palms blistered by the end of the first day. By the end of the second day, the blisters had broken and sealed, and the skin beneath had begun to harden. The first foot went through compacted sand and pebble that the auger managed without great difficulty. The second foot encountered the cemented gravel layer she had expected from the rod tests, calcium-bound and hard, requiring more pressure on each half-turn and producing cuttings that came up in small gray-white chunks rather than loose material. The third foot entered limestone proper, and the work slowed to the pace of careful, sustained effort, the kind of pace that requires abandoning any thought of how far one has to go, and attending only to the work directly beneath the hands. She kept a written record in her father's notebook. She noted the depth of each day's progress and the character of what the auger brought up. Fine sand first, then coarse sand cemented with calcium. Then the beginning of the limestone itself, pale gray and slightly damp to the touch, at a depth of 4 feet 2 inches. Damp, not wet. The limestone cuttings at 4 feet 2 inches held moisture the way a cloth holds moisture when it has been wrung and set aside for an hour. Not dripping, but not dry. She noted the measurement twice and underlined it and kept boring. The 5th day brought rain, which flooded the shaft to a depth of 18 inches and undid the work of a morning's baling before the drainage cleared. She spent the afternoon and evening of the 5th day bailing with a tin can tied to the rope, pulling the water out in measured pulls, feeling the bottom of the shaft with the bail can to track how fast it was draining. It drained steadily, which was consistent with a fractured substrate that had somewhere to put the water. She noted this in the book as well. On the morning of the 4th day, before the rain came, a rancher named Eben Pruitt had ridden along the eastern fence line and stopped to watch her work. He was perhaps 60 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with the weathered economy of motion that comes from a lifetime of knowing exactly how much effort every task requires and expending nothing beyond it. He sat his horse at the fence line and watched her for a considerable time without speaking. She did not stop working. He said finally that the well-witchers had both said this ground was dry. Clara said she was not a well-witcher. He asked what she was then. She said she was her father's daughter, and she kept turning the auger. Pruitt sat his horse for another long minute, and then rode on without further comment. She heard his horse's hooves on the hard ground for a time, and then did not hear them. He came back 2 days later on foot, after the rain, carrying a cast-iron coffee pot and 2 tin cups, and he set them on the rock slab she'd been using as a work surface without comment or ceremony, and he poured 2 cups and set one near her without offering it, and she picked it up when she was ready and drank it while she looked at the shaft. He did not say anything about the well-witchers again. His property bordered Clara's on the east. He had run cattle on the rangeland for 17 years, watering his stock at a creek 2 miles north that ran unreliably and had gone completely dry the previous summer. He was, Clara understood, not a man made curious by idle wonder. He was a man facing a water problem of his own, who had come to look at what she was doing with the attention of someone who has run out of other options and is reassessing the ones he previously dismissed. The 6th day was clear and cold, the sky the thin, hard blue of autumn at elevation, and Clara worked the auger from first light to mid-afternoon without stopping except to bail. On the morning of the 7th day, at a depth of 11 feet and 3 inches, the auger brought up cuttings that were distinctly wet, and when Clara bailed the shaft and lowered her lantern on the rope, she could see at the bottom of the 11-foot bore a thin gleam of standing water. She held herself still for a moment. The lantern swayed slightly on the rope, and the gleam moved and steadied. She lowered the lantern as far as the rope would allow. The gleam became a pool, perhaps 8 inches across, fed by a seep running along a nearly horizontal fracture in the limestone face of the shaft wall. The water was clear. It was not a great quantity, not the surging artesian flow that would have made for a dramatic story. It was a seep. A modest, reliable, honest seep from a fracture that ran along the southeastern dip she had read in the surface depression a week before. Modest. The word her father had used when he taught her to measure the yield of a small seep against the need of a household. Modest water, reliably given, is worth 3 times the spectacle of a gusher that plays out in a dry year. He had written the same thing in his notebook in 1869, after a well in Lincoln County that disappointed the client and irrigated that client's kitchen garden without fail for the next 11 years. Clara had read the entry so many times she could locate it in the notebook by the feel of the page. She left the shaft covered and rode back to Prescott. There was a land office on Gurley Street, and in the land office there were the county's survey plats, filed by the Territorial Surveyor's Office, accessible to any member of the public who presented a lawful purpose for their examination. Clara presented herself on a Tuesday morning in late October and asked to examine the survey records for the section she had purchased and the 3 sections adjoining it. The clerk was a thin, careful young man who clearly had opinions about who generally made use of the survey records, and Clara's arrival had not matched those opinions. He asked the nature of her inquiry with a precision that was meant, she thought, to be discouraging. She told him she had purchased the section at the October auction and wished to examine its recorded survey history. This was unassailable. He produced the plats with a politeness that was close to its opposite and showed her to the examination table as though he expected her not to remain at it long. Clara spread the plats on the table and spent 4 hours with them. The examination table was placed near the office's single east-facing window, which gave good light in the morning and poor light in the afternoon, and she worked quickly in the morning hours, making her own copies of the key figures and notations in a hand that was trained for precision. She had learned to copy survey data accurately during 4 years of drafting work, which meant she had learned to distinguish between information as written and information as intended. The small scribal slips that looked like alterations and the actual alterations that had been made to appear like errors. She looked at the survey notations for the 3 adjacent sections with the same care she gave to her own. What she found took her 2 hours to understand fully and another hour to be certain of, because certainty in this kind of work is not a feeling but a calculation, and calculations want checking. The section she had purchased was recorded in the county survey of 1872 as having no water source, no well, and no subsurface water indicated. The survey had been conducted according to the filed plat by a man named Orville Marsh, who was described on the Territorial Surveyor's rolls as a licensed deputy surveyor appointed by the county in 1871. The survey notation on her parcel was in Marsh's hand. She was fairly certain, though she would want to compare it to other documented examples of his work before she could state it conclusively. It read, "Dry throughout, no water potential, limestone substrate precluding groundwater development." The notation was stated with a confidence that went beyond what a surface and subsurface assessment of a single day's work would support. It was the notation of a man who was not uncertain. She looked at the survey notations for the section directly to the south. The section to the south was noted as having water rights appurtenant to a well located at coordinates she read carefully twice and then wrote down 3 times in her own notebook to be certain she had them correctly. The coordinates placed that well on the northwestern corner of the southern parcel. She held a straight edge along the survey plat and ran a line from those coordinates in the direction of the fracture dip she had read on her own land, running southeast to northwest. The line extended across the section boundary, passed directly through the area of the depression in her creek bed. The same fracture, the same underground source. The boundary line between the 2 sections ran across it, but the water below did not recognize that boundary. The section to the south was owned by a land company incorporated in Maricopa County in 1873, called the Rim Country Land and Grazing Association. Its agent of record was listed as a man named T.D. Ashcraft. She turned back to the records register and looked for Orville Marsh. She found him in a deputy surveyor appointment log from 1871. She found him in 2 other survey plat signatures from 1872 and 1873. She found him in a separate register the clerk brought without enthusiasm when she asked for the association's recorded agents as a deputy agent of the Rim Country Land and Grazing Association from 1872 to 1876. The same man. The survey of her parcel had been conducted by a man employed by the same company that held the neighboring parcel with its documented water right. The 2 rolls were not recorded in the same document. Nothing prevented a deputy county surveyor from also working as a land company agent, at least in 1872, when the territorial surveyor's rules of conflict were not as precise as they might have been. The combination produced an outcome that was difficult to explain as coincidence. The parcel above the fracture's intake had been assessed as having no water potential, suppressed in value, driven eventually to auction and sold for $6, while the parcel above the fracture's outlet had been documented with an appurtenant water right and held by the company whose employee had conducted the upstream survey. Clara copied every figure carefully into her father's notebook. She did not speak her conclusions aloud in the land office. She thanked the thin young clerk for his assistance, replaced the plats exactly as she had found them, and walked out onto Gurley Street in the October afternoon. She sat on the steps of the courthouse across the street and let the information settle, watching the foot traffic on the street and thinking about what she had and what it meant and what could be done with it through the proper channel, which was the only channel she intended to use. The fracture seep on her land fed the same subsurface channel that supplied the documented well on the Rim Country parcel to the south. The survey that had assessed her land as dry and worthless had been conducted by a man employed by the same company that held the neighboring parcel with its documented water right. The assessment had suppressed the land value, driven the parcel to auction, and ensured that the company's well maintained the only recognized water right along the entire underground fracture line. Modest water, reliably given. In a dry territory, that was not a small thing. She went back to the land and kept boring. By the end of the following week, she had expanded the test shaft into a proper working well, casing the upper 8 feet with flat sandstone she quarried from an outcropping on the north end of the parcel. She worked the sandstone with a cold chisel and the chisel point hammer, splitting pieces to a consistent thickness, stacking them in a dry arrangement against the shaft wall, fitting each course carefully to the curve of the bore. A casing that shifted in a rainstorm would block the seep, and she would have to start again from 8 feet. She worked with the deliberation the task required, and she did not hurry it. The yield of the seep, measured across 4 days of careful observation, using a bucket and a pocket watch, produced a consistent 12 gallons per hour, enough for a household, enough for a kitchen garden a household, enough for a kitchen garden through the summer. Enough, Eben Pruitt said quietly when she showed him the measurement, for 10 head of cattle in a dry season. Pruitt had said very little in the 2 weeks of her work beyond what was necessary. He brought the coffee pot regularly and occasionally helped with the heavier stages of the casing work, when she did not ask him to and when his own labor permitted. He was not a demonstrative man, but he was a precise one, and when he looked at what Clara had found in the limestone, he looked at it the way a person looks at something they had assumed was impossible and are revising their position on. The revision was quiet, and the new position was not announced. He simply began to treat the water as a fact rather than a speculation. She asked him then if he knew a man named Orville Marsh. He took a moment with it. He said there had been a surveyor by that name who had worked the country in the early 70s, but he had not heard the name in years, and when he tried to remember the man's face, he found he could not fix it clearly. He said the Rim Country Land and Grazing Association had bought and sold a good deal of land in that same period, ranch parcels mostly, some water rights, and that several boundary disputes in the region had been settled in their favor in the county recorder's office during the mid-70s. He said the association had largely ceased operations after one of its principals had a dispute in Tucson around 1876 or 1877, and nobody had heard much from them since. He looked at her. He was a man who did not ask questions he had already answered. Clara asked if he knew where a survey error from 1872 might be formally challenged. He said she would want the county assessor's office, a formal resurvey petition and documentation that would hold up to examination. He said the process was slow. Clara said she had the documentation. Pruitt picked up the coffee pot and filled both cups, and they stood at the rim of the completed well in the November afternoon and looked at the water below them without saying more about it. There was nothing more to say that the well had not already said. The process of filing a resurvey petition in Maricopa County in the autumn of 1883 was not swift and was not simple, but it was navigable by a woman who had spent 4 years making fair copies of survey plats and who had read every procedural document in the territorial surveyor's office during her examination visit. Clara submitted her petition in November, attaching her own written survey of the fracture seep, her measurements of the yield over 4 days, her careful copies of the 1872 plat notations, and the comparative analysis she had prepared over several evenings, a document laying out, figure by figure, the well coordinates on the Rim Country parcel, the fracture line on her own land, and the calculation that put them on the same underground source. She included Orville Marsh's dual roll, cited by register entry, date, and page, without editorial comment. She let the figures stand without assistance. The county assessor assigned a licensed territorial surveyor named Cal Mercer to conduct the resurvey. Mercer was thorough and had no recorded association with any land company operating in the region. He spent 3 days on Clara's parcel in December, camping on the land the second night rather than ride back to town, and he drove his own coupling rods along the section line to the south at 6-foot intervals, mapping the fracture's surface expression across 60 feet of its length. His measurements matched Clara's. His yield calculation, run over 2 independent days, matched hers as well, within a gallon per hour. His report, filed in January of 1884, stated that the 1872 survey of the parcel had contained a material error in its assessment of water potential, that a documented subsurface water source existed within the boundaries of the section, and that the coordinates of this source were consistent with the fracture line feeding the documented well on the adjacent southern parcel, indicating a shared subsurface system whose intake lay within Clara's section boundary. He recommended that the county record be corrected and that the water rights appurtenant to the fracture seep on Clara's parcel be formally established in her name. The Rim Country Land and Grazing Association, now a dormant shell with no active agent in the county, filed no objection within the required period. T.D. Ashcraft, whose address of record was a Phoenix street number that turned out to correspond to an empty commercial lot, was not heard from. The county record was corrected in February. Orville Marsh's notation, dry throughout, no water potential, limestone substrate precluding groundwater development, remained in the record as written, crossed through in red ink and annotated with the correction date and Mercer's signature. It was not removed. The record showed what had been said, and then showed it corrected. That was the proper form, and Clara had not asked for anything more than the proper form. Her land was reassessed. The county assigned it a value of $240, reflecting the established water right. She had paid $6. In March of 1884, Eben Pruitt approached her about a water-sharing arrangement. His land had no documented water right along its western border, where it adjoined her parcel. He proposed that she might allow a pipeline easement across her land from his property to her well, in exchange for a payment of $11 per year, and his assistance in expanding the well casing to a depth that would support the additional draw. Clara considered the proposal for 2 days. She said she would accept it, but that she wanted to add one condition. There was a family named Cutter who had been tenants on the Pruitt Range for 6 years, dry farming a small plot in the southeastern corner of his land, carrying water by barrel from the unreliable creek 2 miles north. She had passed their operation twice during her first weeks on the land. There was a woman and 3 children and a husband who had lost the use of his right arm to a threshing accident 4 years prior, farming the hardest ground on the worst water arrangement in the county. The barrel hauling fell primarily to the wife and the 2 older children who made the round trip in a wagon 3 times each week through the summer months. She said she wanted the Cutter family included in the easement at no charge, with a dedicated branch line to their plot. Pruitt looked at her for a moment. Then he said, yes. He said it without qualification and without the pause of a man who needs to think about his answer. The pipeline was completed in late April, the ground having softened enough by then for the trenching. It was a simple arrangement, sections of wrought iron pipe coupled together, running from the wellhead east across Clara's land to the section line, then branching north to Pruitt's stock tanks and south to the Cutter plot. The total run was a little over 300 yards. Pruitt handled the labor on his side with 2 hired hands who knew the work. Clara handled the connection to the wellhead herself, with the coupling method her father had used, pressing the fitted iron collars tight with a wrench she had ground smooth against a limestone block through 2 evenings' worth of patient work until the fit was as close as she could get it. She tested the connection 3 times before she was satisfied with it, running water through at pressure and checking each collar for seep. None of them seeped. The morning they opened the valve at the wellhead, and water ran clear through 300 yards of iron pipe and came out at the Cutter plot's tap. Nora Cutter, who was 41 years old and had been carrying water barrels since her children were infants, stood with her hands at her sides and watched the tap run for a long time without saying anything. Her oldest child, a girl of about 12, reached out and put her fingers in the stream and pulled them back and looked at them. Nora said finally that she had not thought it would look like that. Clara asked what she had expected. She said she had thought water from a pipe would look different from water from a barrel. She did not say in what way. Clara told her it was the same water. Nora Cutter looked at her and at the running tap, and then back at her and said, yes, she supposed it was. Clara went back to her land and to the work that the spring required. She had, by the end of that first winter, established herself in a one-room structure she had built from salvaged timber and the sandstone she had quarried for the well casing. The structure was modest and cold, and had a roof that she intended to improve before the next monsoon season. She had a kitchen garden staked out on the south-facing slope above the well, and she had received 2 commissions for survey drafting from Mercer's office in Prescott, who had seen her comparative analysis in the resurvey petition and found her calculations clean. The land that had been declared worthless was not worthless. The land that had been assessed as dry was not dry. She had known both things before she paid $6 for it in front of a crowd that found the purchase amusing. She had known them because her father had taught her to read the ground for what it actually said, rather than for what a man with a different interest had recorded. There is a particular kind of knowledge that lives in the hands and in the attention that follows them, that no credential grants and no auction dismisses. Albert Finch had understood this, and he had taught it to his daughter across 11 years of work in the dust of New Mexico territory. And when he died, he left it entirely to her, along with the brass-cased pocket level and the coupling rods, and the chisel-point hammer she carried still. The coupling rods stood in the corner of her one-room structure that winter. She had cleaned them and dried them, and leaned them in the corner where they were available to the lantern light when she worked late at the drafting table. She looked at them sometimes in the evenings when the work was done, not with sentimentality exactly, but with the recognition that tools do not become less useful for being inherited, and that some inheritances are exactly sufficient for the problem at hand. The county record, corrected and refiled, showed Clara Finch as the documented holder of a water right on 160 acres in the high dry country east of the Mogollon Rim. The 1872 survey notation was crossed and annotated with the correction date and Mercer's signature. Orville Marsh's declaration that the land was dry throughout and held no water potential stood in the record as the error it had been, neither removed nor hidden, only corrected. That is not nothing. In a territory where a falsified notation had suppressed the value of a parcel for 11 years and steered the water right to a company that had since dissolved without ever being called to account for the survey it had shaped, a cross notation and a correction date is not a small thing. It is the record saying plainly that this was wrong, and here is what was true. The Cutter family dry farmed their plot for 3 more seasons after the pipeline came in, and then in the spring of 1887 they broke ground on a second plot using the reliable water access to irrigate a kitchen garden that grew beyond a kitchen garden. Nora Cutter began selling produce in Prescott by 1888. Her husband, whose usefulness he had doubted since the accident, turned out to have a considerable gift for managing water flow and helped design the branch pipeline's secondary extension when Pruitt's operation expanded to the north. Eben Pruitt's cattle did not go dry in the summer of 1885, which was the worst dry season in the region in a decade. The creek 2 miles north failed entirely by August. His stock tanks, fed by the pipeline from Clara's well, held water. The ranchers to his north and west were not so fortunate. Clara received a 3rd drafting commission from Mercer's office in the summer of 1884, and a 4th in the fall. By 1886, she was doing enough survey drafting work to hire a hand for the spring and fall labor on her land. By 1888, she had expanded her structure to 3 rooms and replaced the provisional roof with one that did not require buckets in July. She was not wealthy. She was established. There is a difference that matters, and in Arizona, territory in the 1880s, the difference was the distance between a correction in the county record and a permanent place on the land. She carried the chisel point hammer in her left coat pocket for the rest of her working life. It was not a talisman, and she did not treat it as one. It was a tool that happened to have been her father's, and it was still sharp, and it still fit the hand. She used it last in the spring of 1891 when she staked the survey corners of a water right extension on the northeastern portion of her land, expanding the documented source boundary to include a secondary seep she had found the previous autumn, running along a parallel fracture 40 yards above the first. The yield of the second seep was 9 gallons per hour, modest water reliably given. She drove the last corner stake with the chisel point hammer at mid-morning, with the shadow of the stake falling short and sharp on the pale limestone ground, and she stood for a moment with the hammer at her side and looked out across the 160 acres that nobody had wanted, that the water witchers had sworn were dry, that the county record had described as worthless from one end to the other. She had put a lantern down into it. She had found what was there. She walked back to the well, which was cased now to 20 feet, and produced its 12 gallons an hour without fail through the third dry summer in a row, and she lifted the cover and looked down into it, as she still did sometimes in the mornings, and the water at the bottom caught the light and returned it. If there is a story someone told you once about ground you were sure held nothing, if there is a thing you were told was dry and empty and not worth the price of entry, think about what you would find if you lowered a lantern into it. Leave a thought in the comments if you care to. It costs you nothing and it helps more than you would expect. There are other stories like this one, from the same hard country and the same forgotten edges of the record, stories about the things that were declared worthless and were not. Stay close for the next one.